Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into the global youth climate movement.
Yeah, we've gathered quite a bit of material reports, surveys, analyses, trying to see what's really going on.
Exactly. We want to look past the headlines. We've got these detailed maps of youth groups, activist surveys, looks at how the movement's changing
Its
it.
impact, right?
Right. So the mission for this deep dive, for you listening, is to really unpack the big shifts, figure out what's driving them, and understand why this movement is so important in the bigger political picture today.
Let's do it. There's definitely a lot to talk about.
Okay, so first thing, something that really jumps out from one of the main reports we looked at, the Mapping the Global Youth Climate Movement one, is this sense of, well, radicalization almost.
It feels like a definite shift. It's not just about, listen to the science anymore.
Right. It's moving beyond just raising awareness.
And the scale of it is interesting. The report found, what was it, 292 youth climate groups all over the world, basically.
Yeah, everywhere but Antarctica, I think.
And more than half of them are saying the root cause is, well, a system that puts profit over people and planet. That's their framing.
That's a pretty strong statement. And they get even more specific, don't they?
They do. Something like 89% of that group specifically call out capitalism and neocolonialism.
Wow. Okay, so that's quite different from the early Fridays for Future vibe,
Yeah.
which was more about like governments needing to be more ambitious, telling the truth about the crisis.
Definitely. The report talks about this new wing emerging. These groups aren't just asking for tweaks. They're calling for, fundamental changes to government, to the economy.
And for you listening, this kind of helps explain maybe some of the more disruptive actions or the really strong demands you might be seeing reported. It's coming from this deeper analysis.
Precisely. And if your analysis of the problem is that deep, your proposed solutions are going to be different too. It's less about appealing to the existing system and more about demanding a new one.
The report even mentioned the potential for decades of intergenerational conflict because of these really different views on what's wrong and what needs doing.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought, how these different worldviews might clash down the line.
Okay, but sticking with that same report for a second, another thing that really stood out and kind of challenges the common picture is where all this activity is happening.
Oh, yeah. The media image is often, privileged kids in the global north, right?
Yeah.
Largely white, middle class.
The data says something else.
It really does. The report found sub-Saharan Africa is actually the most active continent for climate protests.
That's a huge finding and really important for you to know because it completely contradicts that common narrative.
It forces you to rethink who is driving this movement and why. It's truly global.
Maybe it's because the impacts are just so much more immediate and severe in many parts of Africa. That drives the urgency.
That would make sense. It underlines that this isn't some abstract future problem for everyone. For many, it's very much here and now.
Yeah, it definitely pushes back against that narrow view. These are global concerns with really strong roots in places often, sidelined in the main discussion.
And connects to the broader point about climate justice, doesn't it? Those least responsible often suffer the most. So yeah, strong mobilization there isn't surprising when you think about it.
Okay, let's shift gears a little. There's an article from the Lowy Institute. It brings up this question of momentum. Is that initial, huge surge from a few years ago still there?
Right, particularly looking at somewhere like Australia, they have this poll, the Lowy poll.
And what did that show?
Well, concern about climate change among young Australians, 18 to 29-year-olds, it peaked back in 2019, hit about 81%.
Pretty high.
Very high. But by last year, 2024, it had dropped to 73%. Still high, mind you, higher than it was back in 2008 or 2012, but
Yeah.
a noticeable dip from that peak.
So why? What's causing that potential dip or ebb and flow?
The article suggests a few things that, well, they make a lot of sense. Cost of living is one major factor.
Yeah, that's hitting young people hard everywhere. Rent, jobs, just basic expenses.
Exactly. When you're focused on just getting by, maybe dedicating time to activism feels like a luxury you can't afford.
Yeah, it seems plausible. What else?
The poll also showed a slight increase from 18% in 2019 up to 23% last year in young Aussies thinking climate change can be dealt with gradually, low-cost steps.
Interesting. So maybe less urgency or perhaps more faith in incremental approaches or maybe just fatigue.
Could be any of those, or a mix. And then there's just the sheer amount of other stuff that's been happening globally.
Oh, for sure. The article mentions the huge bushfires in Australia, then COVID hit, Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, all sorts of political turmoil.
Yeah, all these massive events competing for attention, for energy, for headspace. Climate change has to fight for space in that landscape.
It's a really complex environment for any movement to sustain momentum in.
And the article raised a couple of other sort of internal movement points, too. One was about the potential downside of the celebrity activist or micro-influencer thing.
Ah, right. Like, does the focus sometimes shift to the individual rather than the collective cause?
Potentially. And also a related idea about a move towards more, let's say, career-focused activism, setting up social enterprises, doing podcasts.
That's valuable, of course.
Absolutely valuable. But the question raised was whether that perhaps draws energy away from the grassroots organizing, the face-to-face stuff, the knowledge sharing that happens there.
That's a tricky balance.
And one last point from that piece, this feeling that maybe climate action has been sort of co-opted or absorbed by governments and businesses.
Like it's become mainstream, so the fight feels less radical, less urgent.
Maybe. And that feeling gets worse, obviously, when you see so much greenwashing around. It's hard to tell real action from PR sometimes.
Yeah, that can definitely breed cynicism. So for you listening, that might explain some skepticism you maybe feel or hear about official climate pledges.
But it's really crucial despite those challenges. We need to remember the power these youth movements have always had. The U.S. Resist News article really drives this home.
Yeah, they make the point that youth movements have consistently been catalysts for big political and social shifts throughout history.
Absolutely. They use the example of the global climate strikes, sparked by Greta Thunberg. You can't deny the impact that had on raising awareness, putting pressure on governments. It was massive.
And it's not an isolated thing. They mentioned the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives in the U.S.
Right. All these movements where young people were really at the forefront, pushing for justice, pushing for reforms. It shows a pattern.
The historical weight is there.
And social media, as the article points out, has just amplified that potential, hasn't it? The speed of organizing and communicating globally, it's a total game changer.
Totally. Though the article does acknowledge the criticisms too,
Yeah.
which is fair. Like, can these movements sustain themselves long term?
Yeah, and how do you actually translate that massive mobilization into concrete policy wins? That's always the challenge.
Plus the downsides of digital platforms, misinformation, surveillance.
Yeah, definitely real. But we also see movements trying to tackle those issues, trying to build sustainable structures. Think about groups like the Sunrise Movement in the U.S., pushing hard for specific policies like the Green New Deal. They're aiming for concrete outcomes.
So looking forward then, that U.S. Resist News piece also talks about elections. Youth movements shaping politics, shaping outcomes.
Yeah, this is becoming increasingly important globally, something for you to really pay attention to if you're interested in where politics is heading.
They mentioned the U.S., for instance. Young voters may be having mixed feelings about the current administration, especially on foreign policy issues like Israel and Palestine. Could that affect how energized they are to vote or mobilize?
It's a real question. And then you look at India, huge number of young first-time voters. Their concerns, climate change, yes, but also jobs, unemployment, digital rights, youth movements there could be incredibly influential.
And Europe too, right? With elections coming up there, young people are mobilizing around climate, social justice, migration, democracy.
For sure. Political parties everywhere are realizing they have to engage with young voters' concerns. They're not just protesters anymore, they're a serious voting bloc.
They hold real electoral power.
And can genuinely swing results and shift policy debates.
Okay, finally, let's bring in the IUCN blog post. It hits home why this is all so urgent for young people specifically.
It really does. It reminds us they're the ones who will disproportionately bear the brunt of the climate crisis.
Yeah, that statistic they cite is staggering. A child born in 2020 facing, many times more extreme weather events than someone born in 1960.
Exactly. Heat waves, floods, droughts. It makes it incredibly personal. It's not abstract. It's their future, their lives.
Which explains the passion, the determination. It's existential for them.
And the IUCN blog also highlights some really positive examples, doesn't it? Successful youth-led initiatives.
Yeah. It's not just about protesting, it's about building solutions too. They mentioned Fridays for Future, of course, but also things like the Global Youth Biodiversity Network.
And local projects like Save the Beach in the Maldives or the Arab Youth Council for Climate Change. Real tangible work.
It shows young people are contributing directly, on the ground, influencing policy where they can. It's impressive.
And the blog makes a strong plea, rightly so, for decision makers to step up. Not just listen, but provide actual support.
Right. Structural changes are needed, plus practical things like funding, mentoring, access to networks.
So these initiatives can grow and last. And it mentions things like Youngo at the UN or Youth Climate Champions, formal ways young people can get involved in policy.
Because ultimately, as IUCN says, including youth voices isn't just nice to have, it's essential. We need their long-term perspective. We need their demand for accountability.
They're not just future leaders, they're critical stakeholders right now, agents of change today.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it feels like the youth climate movement is, well, very much alive, but also changing. There's this clear shift towards more radical systemic demands in many quarters.
Yeah, and the geography is wider than often portrayed, with places like sub-Saharan Africa being incredibly active.
True, it faces hurdles, definitely keeping momentum going with economic pressures, all the other global crises. That's tough.
But it's still a major force pushing for political change, social change, influencing elections, impacting policy. That seems undeniable. It affects all of us.
Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given these really quite radical demands for fundamental system change coming from so many young activists, how do our current political systems, our economic systems, need to adapt to actually engage meaningfully?
What does it really mean to listen to the youth, especially when their diagnosis goes so deep, pointing to the foundations of how our societies are currently run? That's the big question, isn't it?